There are moments in life when you don't make a decision out loud, when nothing is said, nothing is promised, and yet something inside you quietly agrees to a role you never consciously chose. For me, that role was being the one who stayed, the one who helped, the one who was always available when something went wrong. I didn't notice the moment it began, because it didn't begin with anything dramatic. No conflict, no request that felt too big. Just small, ordinary moments that felt harmless at the time, moments that slowly shaped the way I was seen, and the way I learned to see myself. I always believed that being reliable was a virtue, that showing up for people even when it was inconvenient was a sign of character, that if you offered support without hesitation, the world would somehow return that kindness when it mattered. It wasn't naive optimism. It was something deeper than that. A quiet belief that connection was built through consistency, through presence, through being the person others could count on without question. And for a long time that belief felt justified. We had known each other for years, long enough that the early awkwardness had faded, long enough that familiarity replaced formality, long enough that trust no longer felt like something that needed to be discussed. There was nothing special about the way our friendship looked from the outside. No dramatic loyalty tests, no shared secrets that felt cinematic. Just a steady rhythm of being there when needed. When things in his life became complicated. When decisions carried consequences he didn't want to face alone. I was the person he reached out to. At first it felt natural, almost comforting. I listened. I gave advice. I helped him sort through situations that felt overwhelming to him, breaking them down into manageable pieces, offering perspective when his own emotions clouded his judgment. I didn't feel used. I felt trusted. He often told me I was the only person who really understood him, the only one who didn't rush to judge, the only one who stayed calm when everything else felt unstable. And hearing that did something to me. It made me feel necessary, not admired, not praised, but needed, which, in a subtle way, felt even more powerful. I didn't realize then how easily that feeling could become a trap. Because when someone needs you often enough, you start organizing your life around being available, even when they never ask you to do so explicitly. I answered messages quickly. I made time even when I was tired. I adjusted my own priorities without really thinking about it. Not because he demanded it, but because I believed that was what loyalty looked like. And the strange thing is, at the beginning, nothing felt one-sided. There were moments when he checked in, moments when he thanked me, moments when it felt mutual enough to quiet any doubts that tried to surface. So when small discomforts appeared, I dismissed them. When conversations revolved around his problems more than mine, I told myself that everyone goes through phases where they need more support. When weeks passed without hearing from him, only for him to reappear when something went wrong, I explained it away as stress, distraction, or circumstance. I didn't want to believe there was a pattern, because recognizing a pattern would have required me to question something I wasn't ready to question yet. I had built an identity around being dependable, around being the person who didn't disappear when things got difficult, around being steady when others became unpredictable. And once you begin to see yourself that way, it becomes very hard to step out of that role without feeling like you're betraying something fundamental about who you are. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, my presence in his life became situational. I was there when something needed to be explained, when responsibility needed to be shared, when outcomes needed to be softened. But when things were calm, when there was nothing to fix or justify, I faded into the background, and I noticed it, not as a sharp realization, but as a quiet sense of imbalance that lingered beneath the surface. Still, I stayed, because leaving would have required confrontation, and confrontation would have forced me to admit that maybe my generosity wasn't being valued the way I thought it was. So I chose comfort over clarity. I told myself that real friendships aren't transactional, that keeping score ruins genuine connection, that expecting reciprocity is a sign of insecurity. Those ideas sounded noble. They sounded mature. They sounded like the kind of beliefs good people are supposed to hold. What I didn't realize was that unconditional support, when offered without boundaries, slowly teaches others that your time, your energy, and your presence come without cost. And when something comes without cost, it's rarely treated with care. The shift wasn't sudden. It didn't announce itself. It showed up in the way his messages became more direct and less personal. In the way requests replaced conversations. In the way silence filled the space whenever there was nothing he needed. I became efficient, useful, predictable, and the more predictable I became, the less I was seen as a person with limits. There was no malice in it. At least not that I could see at the time. Just a quiet agreement that neither of us had spoken aloud. I would continue to help, and he would continue to rely. And somewhere in that unspoken arrangement, friendship slowly transformed into function. I didn't know it yet, but I was no longer standing beside him. I was standing in front of consequences, absorbing them before they could reach him. There comes a point when you stop asking yourself whether something feels right, and instead start asking how much longer you can ignore the feeling that it doesn't. For me, that point didn't arrive with a single event. It arrived quietly, in the accumulation of small moments that left me feeling heavier each time, as if every act of help added another invisible layer of responsibility I never agreed to carry. I began to notice how my role in his life had subtly shifted. I wasn't invited into moments of joy. I wasn't present when things were easy, light, or uncomplicated. Those moments were shared elsewhere with other people in other spaces. I was called when something needed to be fixed, when a situation needed explaining, when accountability felt too uncomfortable to face alone. And each time I showed up, not because I was asked directly, but because I had already trained myself to respond. The strange part was how natural it felt, how quickly I accepted that this was simply my place in the dynamic. I told myself that everyone has different roles in different relationships, that not all connections are meant to look the same, that being the strong one meant carrying more weight. But strength, when it's taken for granted, slowly turns into silence. I started noticing how little space there was for my own uncertainty, how my doubts were met with indifference, how my need for support was quietly overshadowed by his constant urgency. When I tried to talk about my own challenges, the conversation always found its way back to him, back to his stress, his problems, his situation, not intentionally, just inevitably. And each time I stepped aside, I told myself that timing mattered, that I could share later, that my turn would come. But it never did. The requests became more complex over time. They required more thought, more emotional investment, more willingness to align myself with decisions I hadn't fully agreed with. Sometimes, I felt a knot form in my chest before responding, a quiet hesitation, a sense that I was crossing a line I couldn't quite define. And yet I crossed it anyway, because saying no would have meant disrupting the balance. And disrupting the balance felt more frightening than carrying the discomfort. I had begun to associate my value with my usefulness, with my ability to remain calm when things were falling apart, with my willingness to take on responsibility without complaint. And that association changed the way I saw myself. I stopped asking what I needed. I stopped listening to the internal signals that suggested something was wrong. I convinced myself that fatigue was just part of being dependable. But fatigue doesn't just live in the body. It settles in the mind. I became more cautious, more restrained, less open about my own thoughts, not because I didn't have them, but because I had learned, slowly and subconsciously, that expressing them wouldn't change anything. There was one moment, small, almost insignificant, that should have stopped me. I remember realizing that a situation I had helped manage was being described as something I had actively endorsed. Not in words, not explicitly, but through implication, through the way my presence was referenced, through the way my silence was interpreted. Felt uncomfortable, but again I stayed quiet, because correcting the narrative would have meant creating tension. And tension felt like a threat to the connection I had worked so hard to maintain. So I absorbed it. I told myself it didn't matter, that intentions were more important than perception, that he knew the truth even if others didn't. But intention doesn't protect you from consequences. And silence has a way of being misunderstood. Over time, I realized that I wasn't just helping anymore. I was being positioned, placed carefully between him and the fallout of his choices. Close enough to share responsibility, but distant enough to avoid agency. And the realization didn't arrive as anger. It arrived as sadness. A deep, quiet sadness that comes from understanding that something meaningful has shifted, and knowing you can't return to the version of it you once believed in. I began to pull back, just slightly. Not enough to be noticeable. Not enough to provoke a reaction. I answered more slowly. I hesitated longer before agreeing. I allowed myself to feel the discomfort instead of immediately smoothing it over. And that's when I noticed something else. The more space I created, the more insistent the requests became. There was urgency now, a subtle pressure, an unspoken expectation that I would step in as I always had. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't manipulation in the obvious sense. It was reliance. A reliance so complete that my absence felt like a problem to be solved. And in that moment, I finally understood what had been happening all along. I wasn't being leaned on because I was trusted. I was being leaned on because I was stable, because I didn't push back, because I didn't ask questions, because I didn't make things complicated. I had become the quiet foundation beneath someone else's instability. And foundations aren't thanked. They're expected. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me tired. Tired of explaining. Tired of justifying. Tired of carrying responsibility that wasn't mine. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a question I had avoided for years. What would happen if I stopped? I didn't know the answer yet, but I knew I was close to finding out. The moment of truth didn't arrive with drama. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no final words meant to hurt or to heal. It arrived as a pause where I simply didn't respond the way I always had. I didn't rush to understand. I didn't step in to explain. I didn't volunteer myself as the solution before the problem had even finished forming. I waited, and in that waiting, something important revealed itself. First, there was silence. The kind of silence that feels temporary, like a breath being held. I could almost sense the expectation lingering on the other side, the assumption that I would eventually step forward, as I always did. But I didn't. Not out of resentment, not out of anger, out of clarity. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to stay still, to observe instead of intervene, to listen to my own discomfort rather than immediately erase it. And as the silence stretched, it became clear that my absence wasn't being questioned. It was being noticed as a problem, not because I was missed, but because something no longer worked the way it used to. Messages came eventually, shorter, more practical. There was no curiosity about how I was feeling, no attempt to understand the shift. Only the subtle confusion that arises when a familiar mechanism stops functioning. That realization landed quietly, but it cut deeply, because it confirmed something I had been trying not to see for a long time. I hadn't been valued for who I was. I had been valued for what I absorbed. The responsibility, the emotional labor, the consequences. And once I stopped absorbing them, there was nothing left to discuss. I didn't announce my departure. I didn't explain myself. I simply stepped back. And the world didn't collapse. Nothing dramatic happened. No crisis unfolded because I wasn't there to prevent it. Life continued, which was both relieving and painful. Relieving because it meant I had overestimated my responsibility. Painful because it meant I had overestimated my importance. In the quiet that followed, I finally had space to reflect. I thought about all the times I had ignored my own unease, all the moments I had chosen comfort over honesty, all the ways I had convinced myself that being needed was the same as being valued. It took time to understand the difference. Being needed can feel intoxicating. It gives you purpose, direction, a reason to stay, but being valued feels different. It doesn't drain you. It doesn't require self-erasure. It doesn't disappear the moment you stop performing a role. I realized that I had confused loyalty with endurance, that I had mistaken silence for peace, that I had believed my ability to carry weight defined my worth. And once that belief cracked, everything else followed. I started paying attention to how my body felt around certain people, how conversations either expanded me or quietly compressed me, how some connections felt mutual, while others felt like obligations disguised as care. The clarity wasn't instant. It arrived gradually, like light filling a room you didn't realize was dark. I stopped offering explanations I wasn't asked for, stopped taking responsibility for emotions that weren't mine, stopped stepping forward before being invited. And with each boundary, however small, I felt lighter, not happier necessarily, but more honest. There was grief in that honesty. Grief for the version of the friendship I thought existed. Grief for the time and energy I had invested under the wrong assumptions. But there was also relief, because I no longer had to maintain something that required me to disappear in order to survive. I learned that walking away doesn't always look like a dramatic exit. Sometimes it looks like quiet consistency with yourself, like choosing not to respond immediately, like allowing discomfort to exist without rushing to resolve it. And sometimes that's enough to reveal everything. The truth is, I don't think he ever meant to hurt me. I don't think there was a plan. But intention doesn't change impact. And patterns don't require malice to cause damage. People often take what is freely given, especially when it comes without boundaries. That doesn't make them villains. But it does make boundaries necessary. If the story resonates with you, if you recognize yourself in the role of the one who stays, the one who fixes, the one who carries more than they should, I want you to know this: you are not responsible for holding together what you didn't break. You are not obligated to remain where your presence is only noticed when it's missing. And you are allowed to step away without explaining yourself into exhaustion. Some connections teach us how to care. Others teach us when to stop. Both lessons matter. And sometimes the most meaningful growth happens not when we help more, but when we finally allow ourselves to stop. Some stories don't end with apologies. They end with understanding. If the story felt familiar, you're not alone. Thank you for listening. This was Block Tales.